Hey guys, welcome to Skills for Constitutional Structures. I'm your host, Nate Brody, and I'm just going to jump into it. First, grading. A couple of students after class asked me, well, is there a midterm in this course? How are we going to be graded? What's the evaluation process? So this slide is going to clear up all that information. First, 20% of your grading constitutional structures will be based on an assessment problem. 10% will be a short analytical piece that you'll probably have to present in class. 10% is based on class participation. And the final 60% of your grade is going to be determined by a final examination on December 18th, 2018. So now let's talk about outlining. And I want to start by using the syllabus to structure our outline. And what I'm going to be doing is putting an actual skeleton outline up on Twin, so you guys will have a skeleton outline of the entire course and you can fill things in as appropriate, or use it to actually massage your outline to make it more effective for you. So first, let's take a look at the syllabus. Week 1 was read the Constitution and read the Articles of Confederation, which is background. But now we have our first heading. Chapter 1, the Federal Judicial Power. And then we have this A, the authority for judicial review. And under that, we have Marbury v. Madison, Martin v. Hunter's Lessee, and Cohen v. Virginia. Scrolling down to week 2, we have authority for judicial review continued, and then we have the doctrine of independent and adequate state grounds. Then after that, we have B, limits on the federal judicial power, and under that, we have interpretive limits, and then we have a couple of more cases, then we have congressional limits. And then we move on to the exceptions and separation of power. So we have a lot here in week 1 going into week 2. Let's start here. Week 1, Chapter 1, Federal Judicial Power. So as you can see, this is a straight copy and paste. Chapter 1, Federal Judicial Power, subsection A, authority for judicial review. And then I start Marbury v. Madison, Hunter's Lessee, Cohen v. Virginia. And as you can see, I have this little space under each one of them just for the principle of what these cases are meant to teach me about the authority for judicial review. Marbury versus Madison, for instance, teaches me about the principle of judicial review. It is a starting point. It is where the court tells us that they have the power to say what the law is. And as you can see, I have the date of the case and page numbers where to find it within the book. So now what I've done is I've said, okay, well, this first section, these first 3 cases are really about judicial review. Marbury versus Madison, Hunter's Lessee, and Cohen v. Virginia. So I've added another subsection, I, that says judicial review in those 3 cases. The second subsection, II, is the doctrine of independent and adequate state grounds, and that's Michigan v. Long. It's from a handout on Twin, and under that, I would actually have another section just to tell me maybe a line or 2 lines about what that case represents and what does it tell me about independent and adequate state grounds. And maybe you'd even want a section here that tells you what that doctrine is. What is the doctrine of independent and adequate state grounds? What does it mean? What's the rule? And again, you'll find that on the professor's slides that she provides to you after the class. One thing that you will notice is that under Chapter 1, Federal Judicial Power, Section A, I've colored it red because I want it to be distinguished from any other sections. We're talking about A, and there will probably be a B. So now, going back to the syllabus, I see the A, and I've notated all these cases, and I've put them in an outline format. And now I have this hard B, limits on federal judicial power. And under that, I have interpretive limits and congressional limits. Then I also have exceptions and the regulations clause, and I have separation of powers and limits on Congress's authority. And then we have another color that introduces us to another topic. So let's just stay with interpretive limits. So now, as you can see, A, the authority for judicial power, I've closed that section, but it's still in red to let me know that that's a different section. And now we're talking about section B, limits on federal judicial power. Subsection I is interpretive limits, and I have the doctrine on where it's at, and then I have section 2, congressional limits, and under section 2 I have part 1, which is the exceptions to the regulations clause, ex parte Mercado, and then I have part 2, separation of power as a limit to congressional authority. So in both of these instances, for interpretive limits and congressional limits, I know what cases illustrate these points, and for congressional limits, I know there are 2 different doctrines that I have to know, and there are 2 cases that address what these doctrines mean. Now in the syllabus, going to page 3, we start now with justiciability limits. When you're first looking at this, justiciability limits and prohibition on advisory opinions, they are both bolded and they seem to be identical. So how do we know if prohibition of advisory opinions is a subsection of justiciability limits or if they're two separate pieces of doctrine? So since the professor gives us her PowerPoint presentation after the class, I looked at slides from class 4, which are justiciability limits on federal judicial power. And here it says justiciability limits, we are focusing on 5 justiciability doctrines: prohibition of advisory opinion, standing, ripeness, mootness, and political question doctrine. So there are 5 subsections to justiciability limits, and that has been identified by the professor. So now I'm looking at the syllabus, justiciability limits, and it should be 5: prohibition against advisory opinions, standing, ripeness, mootness, and political question, which they are all here. So now I'm going to go back to the top and now add this into my outline, understanding justiciability limits is the section and these subsections to this, which should be 5, starting with the prohibition against advisory opinions. So now, as you can see, limits on federal judicial power, which was blue, is now closed, and now I've opened up a new section for justiciability limits, and the first subsection is prohibition against advisory opinions. I would actually have a section here that says what this topic is, and here are the cases and the doctrine that explains to me what the prohibition of advisory opinions is. And now, again, I'm going to have 5 of these. So this is the first piece of it. Now, section 2 is standing. Now, again, all of these were highlighted the same way, but standing also is highlighted the same way, but based on this slide, we know standing is a subsection of justiciability limits. So in our outline, we're going to identify it as section 2 for justiciability limits. So section 2 for standing, this is a copy and paste from the syllabus. Now, as we look at the syllabus, understanding, you see constitutional standing requirements, injury in fact. We have 3 cases. Then we put notes on constitutional standing requirements, injury in fact, causation, and redressability. And we have another 3 cases. And then we have causation and redressability, which are identified in the notes on page 66 and 67. So just taking a copy and paste of what we see here on the syllabus, it looks like this. But this doesn't really tell me what the requirements are for constitutional standing. It kind of has everything together. The professor has identified the constitutional requirements for standing, which are injury, causation, and redressability. So we have these 3 elements that have to be satisfied. So now my outline should address these in this way: injury, causation, and redressability. So as you can see, I'm now changing my outline to have an injury, causation, and redressability. So now looking back at the professor's slide, this is just making sure that all we have to know for constitutional standing is injury, causation, and redressability, and to see if we can get any more clarity on what these 3 things are. Here is a slide that says standing, injury, causation, and redressability. So let's read it. To establish Article 3 standing, a plaintiff must show an injury in fact. That's what we want to know, which must be. Okay, so we know this is what an injury in fact is based on this slide. It's concrete and particularized. Okay, that seems like be 1 element. Distinct and palpable. Okay, that's 2. And actual or imminent. So these 3, since it must be these 3, these are 3 elements that have to be satisfied. Now, what else does it say? Well, it's not abstract, conjectural, or hypothetical. So we now have 3 positive things that we have to satisfy: concrete and particularized, distinct and palpable, and actual or imminent, and things that will not be identified as an injury in fact, or things that are just too abstract, conjectural, or hypothetical. What about the second? Well, it says an injury must be fairly traceable to the challenged action. To me, that sounds like causation. And what about redressability? Well, it says the relief of the injury must be likely to follow from a favorable decision. Redressability. We have directly an understanding of each one of these elements and how they are to be satisfied. So now let's add that to the outline. An injury in fact, we now have our 3 elements: concrete and particularized, distinct and palpable, actual or imminent, and we have what they cannot be or what it can't be: abstract, conjectural, and hypothetical. So we have three distinct elements to satisfy an injury of fact. Remember, the slide said what it must be. For causation, we now know exactly what causation is. The injury must be fairly traceable to the challenged action, and now we know exactly what redressability is, where relief from the injury must be likely to follow from a favorable decision. So now we have a clear understanding of what constitutional standing is, what the three elements required, and how an injury in fact has three separate elements that have to be satisfied. So now we go back to the syllabus and we see prudential standing requirements, which are italicized, but they are falling under the standing section of the syllabus. So prudential standing requirements, we have under that third-party standing and prohibition against generalized grievances. So just like constitutional standing requirements here, there are some standing requirements for prudential standing requirements. In Section 2 of Justiciability Limits, we have one constitutional standing, and they are third-party standing. We have the cases and illustrations to tell us what that is. We have the prohibition against generalized grievances. We have the cases and understanding of what that is. And now, for standing, we have a clear understanding. There's a constitutional standing requirement, there's a prudential standing requirement, and what each one of those sections represent. Now, based on the slide from the professor, we know that this section will be finished as of now, and we're going to have three more sections of justiciability limits to address. And we know that because here are the 5 justiciability doctrine that we're going to be going on in class. We've finished with standing, and now we're going to ripeness, mootness, and political question doctrine. But just to be sure that we're finished with standing, let's look at the syllabus. And as you can now see, standing, constitutional standing requirement, prudential standing requirement, and the next section is ripeness, which we haven't touched yet. Now, one thing I do want to mention about standing before we forget is that constitutional standing is a requirement by Article 3 of the Constitution, and it can only be changed by constitutional amendment. Prudential standing is different. It's a self-imposed limit, and Congress can actually change that by passing appropriate legislation. So that's something that you need to be able to understand when you're talking about standing in this way. So now we've addressed constitutional structures and just starting an outline and understanding what the outline should start looking like. I'm going to put a skeleton outline on Twin so you can see everything that I've put here in an actual outline format. And then you can massage it to either help identify some things you're missing in your outline, or you can use some of the techniques that I've shown you here to make your outline more successful. I hope this was helpful. Please remember to hit that bell and to subscribe to the channel. I'll be putting up one of these every week. Our next skills session will have to deal with evidence and understanding the rules and how to work through the rules. This is Nate from Academic Skills. Thank you for watching this video on the constitutional structures and outlining, and I'll see you next time in class.